The height of Scandinavia's power in recent history was the colloquial North Sea Empire, a union between the kingdoms of England, Denmark, and Norway. One of the great thalassocracies of the medieval era, the North Sea Empire is a distant memory of the Estrid rulers of Denmark now, a historical curiosity and point of pride for a family on the decline. Historically, the Estrids would rule Denmark and later the Kalmar Union of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark itself until the death of Queen Margaret, the last Estrid monarch, who would be replaced briefly by a Pomeranian family, and then, ultimately, with the House von Wittelsbach. That history is what we know, but there's always the history of another world. A world where the Estrids fought to reclaim at least some of their glory from centuries past. Denmark in 1337 is on the decline, having lost control of Scania to the Swedes and dealing with unrest in their Estonian holdings. The Hansa has slowly gained dominance in the Baltic trade, and all the Danes have left is their control over the Straits of the Sound. As if that wasn't bad enough, Denmark starts the game with a lot of debt and a regency. Nonetheless, this Scandinavian kingdom, which once struck fear in the hearts of all along the North Sea coast, has immense opportunity to grow. The Lübeck market is rich, albeit distant from Roskilde and Copenhagen, the hearts of Danish urban life. In today's video, we'll be pursuing Denmark's return to glory by looking to its historical position in the North Sea for inspiration. It should be noted that the North Sea Empire is an actual formable in-game, but you need to have ahistorical formations as a game rule on, and I didn't have that on, so I thought it didn't exist at the time of recording. Therefore, I won't actually be forming the new tag, but instead I'll be simply embodying the North Sea Empire via conquest and vibes, I guess. With that, let's begin with the all-important task of actually fixing Denmark and its destitute situation on game start. Denmark begins the game under the regent Gerhard von Schauenberg, who is the ruler of Holstein-Rendsburg. He's ruling in place of Valdemar Estrid, a teenager currently residing in Bavaria. Now, having a regency isn't so bad, but what's really holding Denmark back is their over 400 ducats of debt at the start of the game. Debt decreases crown power and adds interest to our expenses. We're currently losing over 40% of our crown power to debt and paying 2.5 ducats to interest for these loans. This situation must be amended as soon as possible. The way we do this is by destroying the forts. The truth is, these beautiful castles which dot Denmark are simply too expensive. Although a part of this proud kingdom's history, the economic realities of the modern world demand adaptation. In terms of government reforms, we'll be using harbor administration, which will help project control via the seas. And we'll grab autocracy, which might help to offset some of our lost crown power from the debt. For rivals, we're keeping it Scandinavian for now, with Scania, Sweden, and Norway becoming Denmark's mortal enemies for the near future. When it comes to friends, no one seems to be an interesting choice, but Scotland could make for a solid future friend against Norway, or even in the ambitious dreams of a soon-to-be resurgent Denmark against England. By the way, one way to help fix your crown power is to assign an Estrid to your navy, as having your armies and navies led by members of the crown estate gives you a pretty nice boost. After that, I set my trade to be automatic because I still can't be asked to do all this button clicking myself, and now we've got a slightly positive balance by spending pretty much nothing on stability or diplomacy. By the way, that 7% crown power we started with quickly doubled as the game decided to apply the regent's administrative skill to it, and after a month tick, Otto Estridson's command of the navy kicked in, putting us up to 14% crown power. In case you ever doubted how important crown power is, you can see that my income has jumped from a measly 2 ducats a month to almost 8 ducats. Crown power is big. Well, I say that, but then went back down to 2, so I don't know. I think trade is fluctuating or something, and basically, I don't know what I'm doing, but we will succeed. Failure to understand game mechanics aside. One event which pops up pretty early and helps pay off the debt is the sale of Southern Holland, which I must say is an immense scam for the Swedes. Imagine paying 250 ducats for 2 rural locations that go to a vassal. Those 250 ducats will immediately go into paying off most of the debt, and in so doing, crown power jumps up to 21%. Yeah, so I said Denmark's start is destitute, but in reality, things are pretty good out here. Oh, by the way, I entirely forgot to set up my cabinet until July of 1339. Hilarious, well done me. I'm going to strengthen my government and increase stability, since both of those things will increase my income. It's all about money right now. Anyway, thanks to the genius economic leadership of the regent Gerhard, Denmark has just 13 ducats of loans remaining as of November of 1339. How wonderful! With these recent successes, the realm assembled in Roskilde for parliament. This might sound ambitious, but the plan is to host some army exercises in preparation for some conflicts with Sweden. Although Gerhard made the choice to sell Southern Holland, there were no additions to their agreement of sale that forbade something like a declaration of war and annexation by right of conquest. Scania is, at least at this point, still a Danish majority region, and as such, its reclamation is not just of interest to the Danish crown, but in fact it's imperative, as Denmark claims rule over all Danes. Before worrying too much about war with Sweden though, Gerhard used the parliament's support to change the kingdom's distribution of power away from the traditional reliance on the estates to instead favor the ruler. Although only a regent, wise Gerhard is thinking about how difficult it might be for the future Estrid kings of Denmark to maintain power with the current political makeup of the kingdom. Essentially, Gerhard is setting up a proper centralization of the kingdom, which as of now is completely decentralized. Anyway, in February of 1340, the entire Danish debt has been paid off, and with it comes our first actual progress towards really playing the game, in the sense that now I can start making buildings. Paying off debt is such a priority that indeed I did nothing but save money for the last 3 years of the game. So begins the question of what exactly Denmark's economic opportunities are. Well, most of Denmark's RGOs are wheat, and I mean like a lot of it is wheat. Denmark is a farming beast apparently, which is nice to start since we can sell food for a couple ducats. Rather than focus on a totally agrarian economy though, I'm going to make some scriptoria, and yes, that is how you pluralize scriptorium, because books are pretty much always in demand. We'll diversify the economy a bit later, and the Lübeck market is pretty rich in terms of demand for many luxurious, high price, and high profit goods, but for now, the economy will spiral up slowly. Gerhard sat in the throne room, exhausted from his work to give Denmark a chance at achieving something. However, he would find his work rewarded in a way only appropriate for a thankless regent. He was assassinated in January of 1342, with the nobility perhaps blaming him for their recent recession of power. In Gerhard's place did Valdemar IV Estridsson, a rightful claimant to the throne, become king. This conveniently coincided with the dawn of the Age of Renaissance, where I took a military focus and then got Valdemar married to the Princess Elżbieta Piast of Poland. In terms of Danish ambitions for a relationship with Poland, the idea comes from a general sense of opposition to the Germans of the Baltic coast, and more specifically, the Hansa, whose trade power in Lübeck is in direct competition with Danish interests. Poland's main rival is of course the Teutonic Order, also a group of encroaching Germans, so the two share an animosity for their German neighbors. A few months later, Valdemar got his brother, Otto Christopherson, married to a Scottish princess, Margaret de Bruce. In this case, the plan is a little more sinister. While Gerhard worked hard to secure Denmark's centralization and proved that truly no good deed goes unpunished, Valdemar is interested in using the gifts that his regent, and maternal uncle I should add, have given him to make his first moves towards the reconstruction of the North Sea Empire, and that starts with getting some kind of foothold in Britain. By marrying into the Bruce family, it's quite possible that Valdemar can, in good time, claim the Scottish throne for himself. Despite his great political aspirations, the king finds himself returned to reality when Estonia, a distant territory of the kingdom, rose up in rebellion. In response, Valdemar cocked an eyebrow and genuinely asked his cabinet if Estonia is really even doing anything for them. The cabinet looked at each other and just sort of shrugged. One piped up that Gerhard sold Halland to the Swedes and those villages contributed basically nothing to the nation. The implication of this statement of course being that perhaps Estonia is an analogous territory. In response, Valdemar sent word to the Teutons that he'd be willing to sell the territory, which they of course accepted. Now this could be seen as a betrayal of the Poles, but Valdemar made sure to write to his Piast in-laws that actually, Estonia is a distraction for the Prussian orders, who will have to work pretty hard to keep the unruly pagans of the Baltic suppressed. This placation worked, and so Denmark returned to peace richer than it was before, missing out on a land that, in all honesty, had next to no value for the kingdom. That money was immediately invested in some fine cloth guilds, which will hopefully be able to make some revenue for the kingdom, whose economy has been growing around the towns of Roskilde and København. The economy is the backbone of any military campaign, so yes, the next couple years would indeed be the continued growth of Denmark. Valdemar would use his popularity among the nobles to continue pushing legislation, including a change to a noble levy law in December of 1344, which would busy the nobles with preparing their knights and bannermen for war, rather than relying on the mass of bodies the peasants could supply. In terms of values, by the way, I'm pushing for a similar build to what I used in the Italy playthrough, except aristocratic and traditional economy oriented. I'm still going for humanism and innovation because they're just way too good to pass up, but in terms of the traditional economy angle, I'm doing that because for right now, a lot of my money comes from the wheat that I'm growing. It helps profits a lot to be on traditional economy if most of your income comes from RGO taxation. RGOs contribute their income to the common folk, hence why most early game economies rely on RGOs so strongly. In August 1346, an heir to the Danish throne was born. This is Christopher, the son of Valdemar and Elżbieta. With this infant comes a future king with claims to Poland and Denmark, the combination of which would be a truly menacing union. Time will tell if it works out. Alongside that, Valdemar's brother Otto had a son with Margaret de Bruce a few years before. This child, also named Christopher, is a couple years older than the Crown Prince Christopher, but he could be a just cause for a claim to Scotland's throne too. As of April of 1347, the Danish income has surpassed 10 ducats, and with that, the economy is feeling strong. Denmark was only a decade ago in dire straits, but now finds itself prospering. This era of Denmark's decay has ended, and it's ready to rise like a phoenix, if not for the rapidly approaching Black Death. Looking to assert some Danish sovereignty in Scotland, Valdemar sent his army over to help put down some Scottish rebels. The idea here is to begin associating Denmark and its rulers with the Scottish world. The Danish army brought with them some tubo cheese, which is the only Danish cheese I could find that has existed since the Middle Ages. I was surprised to see that most Danish cheeses I'm aware of, like Danelaw and Havarti, are pretty modern things. Regardless, this light export of Danish culture to Scotland is yet another of King Valdemar's long-term machinations and ambitions, the list of which is starting to become so long that even he's losing track. In terms of mechanics, by the way, what I'm describing is represented by me gaining favors for helping Scotland in this war, which I will later use to click the Improve Cultural Opinion button. Cultural opinion makes accepting a culture cheaper and makes pops of that culture gain more satisfaction. So the idea is to make friends with the culture so that when they get conquered, they're easier to rule. The Scottish situation was pretty dire by August 1347, with the rebels controlling nearly everything outside of Perth and its countryside. The arrival of nearly 12,000 Danes did spark a great boost of morale in the Scottish forces, and Valdemar was welcomed as a friend and ally. He's not an amazing general or anything, but the king felt it important that he personally lead his men, which he did during the handful of battles he participated in against the Scottish rebels. After the rebels were reduced to just one fort in Brucksburg, the rebels surrendered, and the Danish troops shook the hands of their Scottish allies and sailed home. They returned to a Denmark shaken by the arrival of the Black Death. Although it's only just started spreading, the Black Death is tightening its grip on Denmark, which for now has taken measures to segregate the infected, which is furthering my attempts to push communalism. This value reduces migration speed, but everything else it grants is really good, so it's quite worthwhile in my opinion. Checking in on the Crown Prince Christopher, we can see that he's become shrewd, which gives him bonuses to his military and administrative abilities, which happen to be my favorite stats personally. Of course, this shrewd child will find himself needing to put his bright mind to work sooner than expected, as King Valdemar came down with the plague upon his return to Roskilde, shortly after which he died, but not before appointing his wife, Elžbieta Piast, to be the regent for his son. In an instant, all the plans Valdemar had for the ascension of the Danish crown collapsed into the hands of his consort regent, and many in the realm doubted how effective of a leader this Polish consort would be. Little did they know, her desperation to ensure her one and only son Christopher would have a safe rule would drive her to become one of Denmark's most celebrated rulers. Immediately after taking the throne, Elžbieta sponsored mass forgiveness of sins in the realm, including her late husband's. She designated a period of mourning to go on for a few months, during which Danes would be asked to include her husband's eternal soul in their prayers for their families. Her efforts would see Denmark shift even further towards a communalist value. Soon after, she hosted Parliament to discuss the agenda for her regency with the Lords of Denmark. After garnering their support, she sought to prove her dedication to the Danish cause. In a time of great loss, such as a horrible plague, the people need a cause to keep them going. The people cannot lose hope, and she intends to rally them around a war to reclaim Scania, which the Swedes stole. The first proper war of the campaign, we shall reclaim our cores in Scania. You might be wondering why I didn't simply make a spy network in Sweden and fabricate a reconquest casus belli with it so I didn't have to waste a parliament CB on this war. And the answer is that my ability to build a spy network in Sweden is almost nothing due to their cultural tradition vastly outshining my cultural influence. The best way to get cultural influence is through universities and art. We're quite early in the game, and the Renaissance hasn't spread to Denmark yet, but once it does, we might start creating some great Danish works of art that could help our influence. Basically, my choice is to either wait for literal decades to make a CB, risking getting caught and losing my progress, or just spend the parliament support in a CB. In terms of the war, well, Scania has no forts. That means that crossing the straits and occupying the puppet fiefdom of Sweden is a joke. Even in Geatland, both east and west, Sweden has no forts, and their army, even combined with Norway's, is quite tiny. The war very quickly went completely in Denmark's favor, and peace was signed in June of 1351, with all of Scania and a promise of reparations to be extracted from Sweden. The nice thing about taking Scania is that it's all my cores, so no need to integrate or anything. This land will quickly gain control and begin contributing to my economy. Now that Scania is gone, erased from history, Denmark needs a new rival. Naturally, that would be England. And in announcing this, Elžbieta has put up a strong start to her regency. She's gained the approval of the Danish petty nobles, and with it, confidence in her rule and intentions to maintain Valdemar's ambitions. In terms of the actual gameplay implications of taking Scania, there is actually an amber RGO in Gladsaxe, which is a very valuable resource because it can be used for jewelry to replace the normally quite rare gems. Amber is also pretty rare, but now that we have some, we might be able to make a lot of money producing jewelry with this amber. Amber is also valuable as a straight-up export, again, much like gems. Before making more RGOs though, I need to get more lumber, since it's a construction good for most RGOs. There are some lumber RGOs in Denmark, but most of how I'll be acquiring it will be via lumber mills. By the way, there is flavor for reconquering Scania, but the event for it for some reason triggered years later. In September of 1355, I got the event for reconquering Skåneland. I can pick between a temporary max control bonus in the whole region, or some stability in army tradition. I just chose the stability, although the control could have been nice. I tend to perhaps overvalue stability in my games because I like that it makes the states more loyal and therefore more taxable. Here's a look at that amber and Gladsax, by the way. You can see that its profits are 1.36 per level, which is about as good as the fine cloth industry over in Copenhagen. The obvious issue is that we don't have as much control there, so we won't be getting the proper taxes on those amber deposits. Anyway, peace continued in Denmark for a few years, with my focus being on making buildings and watching the nation's income slowly increase. I'm also managing my values and continuing to work towards an innovative value set. That was until 1359, where Scotland spent some favors to call me into war. They're attacking some Irish clan, but before I could even organize my army to get across the North Sea, the Scots took a white peace. Well, if that's your choice, guys, cool, I guess. In 1360, I raised taxes via Parliament to see just how much money I could make, and indeed I've got over 20 ducats of income each month while the taxes are elevated. It's pretty nice, I won't lie. I should emphasize that I'm not like super good at EU5 economics, given I use a pretty small brain tactic of just sorting by profitability and building, but I was feeling pretty proud of my little Denmark here as I was playing. Alongside stacking up my income, I've got a ton of drift towards innovative values on account of changing some laws and adding a lot of burgher privileges. The nice thing about this is the timing. Institutions like the Renaissance will take a while to spread to Scandinavia, but once they do, I'll have a big discount to embracing them thanks to my innovative values. Crown Prince Christopher came of age in March of 1362, becoming a relatively okay adult. His diplomacy skill is low, but his administrative and military skills aren't too bad. Nonetheless, I actually chose to extend Elżbieta's regency for a bit because I wanted to see if maybe she could seize the throne. There's a button to seize the throne as a regent, if you have no heir to the realm, but I think there may also be events for seizing the throne if the regent rules long enough. I wasn't sure if I wanted to suddenly drag Denmark down the path of a Polish dynasty, but just in case I ended up wanting to, I did extend the regency. I also got Christopher married to a Catalan princess from Athens. In fact, the heiress to Athens, Violante de Barcelona. There's potential for a kind of useless but still kind of cool union there. Elżbieta continued her rule, assigning her son Christopher to the cabinet where he could learn some of the ins and outs of governance to prepare him for the throne. Meanwhile, the Duchy of Schleswig was dissolved into the Kingdom of Denmark proper, as the kingdom had gone down a great centralization effort for decades now, starting with Gerhard I regent. With Schleswig integrated, there's some more lumber RGOs we can access, but beyond that it's not too interesting of an acquisition. Elżbieta hosted what should in theory be her last parliament in December of 1364, where she's looking to expand Denmark's farming, but she used that proposal to instead garner support for a change to a court of culture. I'm mostly doing this for the innovation drift, but the cultural influence will be nice too. The unfortunate thing about court of culture is of course the increased cost of court, but I do like to stack innovative value. Speaking of innovation, I changed up some of my economic tactics just to try something different. For anyone that ever wonders about metas or strategies and stuff, one of the best recommendations I can give is to just try things and see how it works out. In January of 1366, I started focusing almost entirely on RGOs. It's important to note that I have a ton of traditional economy value, so RGOs perform better than they would in other nations that lean more towards a capital economy. The nice thing about the mass expand button is that it takes into account your control and market access in a location, so it actually builds pretty intelligently. What it doesn't take into account is supply chains and the potential for the increased supply of a less profitable good to increase profitability in an urban building. In that sense, you'd be better micromanaging your economy, but otherwise it's a nice button. Anyway, it was with that economic expansion that Elżbieta finally, in March of the following year, gave up the throne to her son Christopher. Despite how horrific the Black Death had been for the realm, the Danes actually got through it without too much hassle. Elżbieta proved to be a more than competent regent in the face of her husband, the king's death. She deepened the connection between the Poles and the Danes in a way that ambitious Christopher might use for his own gain. He grew up shrewd like his father, and this king has plans of his own which may even surpass those of the old king. A long time ago, the peoples of the Baltic Sea lived in fear of the Danes. The Jomsviking pirates that harangued the seas and coasts of this little corner of Europe made sure that everyone knew who the real bosses were. Over time, though, raid morphed into trade, and those who previously had to be coerced could instead be convinced to give up their things. The world is a cruel place, but never so cruel as the agonizing shame that history casts on nations and peoples that fall from grace. While Denmark's return to form in recent decades has been a great pride for them, there's still an understanding that the Danes are now nothing more than toll collectors from their frozen huts in Roskilde. In truth, most Danes were quite content to live their lives farming the prosperous fields of Zealand, but the weight of the Estrid name hung heavily on Christopher. The land called Denmark once stretched from Jutland to Lübeck, and overseas from Estonia to England. Though the English are still too mighty a beast to take on, but the Baltic Sea is sure looking reclaimable right about now. There are two major enemies of Denmark which stand in the way of a Baltic empire. The Hansa, who rule indirectly the cities of Hamburg, Lübeck, Bremen, and many other important cities along the Elbe River, and the Teutonic Order, who rules the rich cities of the Prussian and Livonian coasts. Cities like Danzig and Riga have been colonized by Germans thanks to the Teutons, but they are of critical importance to any realm looking to control the Baltic Sea, and so Christopher made it the goal of his reign to see these two foes of Denmark defeated. There's an important step to making a new era in a kingdom's history, and that is to move the capital. Roskilde is an old city and a major hub from the Viking era, but to the east, situated in a better location for a harbor, is Copenhagen. The town is also quite old, but it's a newly emerging urban center in Scandinavia. Historically, the Danish capital was moved to Copenhagen as a result of the Kalmar Union, where the Danish king, Eric of Pomerania, turned a castle there into his own personal holding from which he governed. Maybe he just liked the castle's location or something, but essentially, it was a move from the old Denmark to the new Denmark, at least in my mind. For Christopher, it's about making a strong entrance. Okay, in terms of gameplay though, Copenhagen has way more natural harbor suitability, making it significantly better as a capital, and in fact I'd recommend you move the capital there right on day 1 of your campaign if you want to play optimally. The downside to that is that the flavor event which moves it also gives you a royal court building in Copenhagen, which is normally a pretty expensive building, and you'll miss out on that if you move it manually. To give you an idea of how much better my proximity is in Copenhagen than Roskilde, I looked around my control map mode to see that on average, I was getting something like 10 to 15% more control in most of my kingdom. That's insane. Anyway, that marriage into the Scottish Bruce family that Christopher's father Valdemar arranged a long time ago has finally borne fruit, as the king there died in April 1369. This gives me a claimed throne casus belli, but alongside that, the heiress ended up being the very daughter that Christopher's uncle Otto was married to. That means the heir to the Scottish throne is Christopher's own cousin, also named Christopher. Dude, can the Danes get some more names, please? Jokes aside, this doesn't actually mean all that much for the game, given it's quite unlikely I'll be able to unify the thrones peacefully, unless I want to get some inbreeding going. But it is cool to see that a Danish Estrid may soon inherit the Scottish throne. 2 Christophers, cousins, and kings of each end of the North Sea, something for the sagas for sure. Time for the first Parliament of Copenhagen, where Christopher made no attempt to hide his ambitions. He told the Parliament he'd like to invade Danzig, and his Polish mother, who for now commanded more respect than he did, backed him up, naturally wanting to help her family in Poland fight off a mutual enemy. The Parliament was quite happy to get back to war, and there was enthusiasm all around at the prospect of a renewed Denmark. The Parliament granted the war proposal, and the very same day Christopher drafted the declaration of war to the Teutons. Taken somewhat by surprise, the Teutons hadn't even fortified their core city of Danzig, and Danish armies flooded the place, evocative of the old Vikings and their ruthless pillaging. Rather than get involved in the fighting personally like his father used to, Christopher stayed aboard his navy, believing that a Danish king is more useful as an admiral than a general. The actual fortress standing in the way of annexing Danzig is the Teutonic capital of Marienburg, which is a well-fortified and well-constructed work of Prussian obstinance. The Teutonic Crusaders had at one point been among the fiercest warriors of the Middle Ages, and their reputation was great, but in truth they'd grown soft recently. Their religious zeal has been replaced with a bureaucratic cowardice, which saw their troops often preferring surrender to the financial loss of battle. Men, their armor, and their weapons are expensive, and papal contributions in light of the recent investiture crisis with France have been light. The Teutons have in recent history morphed into nothing more than another realm of greedy lords. It's quite likely that the Danes could overrun the entire order and rule the Baltic in one go. Nonetheless, Christopher demonstrated his willingness to be reasonable with the Teutons when his son was born near the beginning of the siege of Marienburg. The logistic realities of sieging the Teutonic capital made him uncertain of the wisdom of protracted war, and he wanted to be there for his son's baptism, so he parlayed with the Teutons. He asked for Danzig and its countryside, and in return he'll leave the Teutons in relative peace, at least for now. It's not exactly a golden deal for the Prussians, but they had no real choice in the face of total collapse. Thus the Teutons gave up some reparations and control over Danzig. Integrating it will take some time, and in fact it will take so long that I ended up choosing to make a fiefdom there instead. Christopher sent his mother, Elżbieta, to govern there, and this is where I actually had a huge RP misplay. Had I released Danzig as a vassal instead of as a fiefdom, I could have actually assigned Elżbieta to rule it, since you get to pick who rules in a new vassal when you create one. That could have been really cool, but oh well. Gameplay wise, the big reason to make Danzig into a vassal instead of trying to personally integrate it is that right now I don't have enough of a navy to get any maritime presence to possibly spread control over there, so alongside needing something like 20 years to integrate the land, I'd also be getting practically nothing out of it. Later on in the game, when we start assembling a proper royal navy that can project control, Danzig will become a much more powerful and important city. For now though, a fiefdom or vassal makes the most sense. I mentioned earlier that King Christopher had a son, by the way. This is him, Valdemar. I'm starting to really regret not picking out some names manually, since so far I've had a whole lot of Christophers and Valdemars, which is making distinguishing them difficult. This is Crown Prince Valdemar, as opposed to King Valdemar, Christopher's father who died of the plague, and uncle of King Christopher of Scotland. You're not confused or anything, are you? Good. He Here's the institution spread of Renaissance, by the way. I really want the Renaissance because it will let me start investing in art. I should emphasize that art is mostly a waste of money in EU5, but I personally enjoy making a lot of cool art simply for the roleplay of actually developing a culture into something more than just a conquest machine. The intended purpose of art is to get cultural influence, which helps you with incorporating states, building spy networks, and other useful stuff, but the best way to get cultural influence is to make universities. We can't make universities until we get Renaissance, so that's another reason to really want it to spread. In theory, I could expedite the spread by trading with markets where the Renaissance is present. However, Italy and Austria are both out of my trade range, so the AI will have to get it spread up to at least Köln for me to be able to get those institution-based trades going. Anyway, time for another parliament in Copenhagen. This time, Christopher's war plans were aimed at Sweden. Now, attacking Sweden doesn't really have much to do with controlling the Baltic Sea, or rather, the Western Baltic Sea, which is what Christopher is focusing on. Instead, attacking Sweden is about warding off any potential vulnerabilities the kingdom could have. The Swedes are, quite frankly, vastly inferior to the Danes, and there goes my relationship with Paradox, by the way, but their land acts as an easy access path right into the Danish heartland. A buffer is necessary, and again, the nobles of Denmark are quite happy to facilitate it. Just like with the war for Scania some decades ago, Sweden has shown their utter incompetence that they haven't made any forts, and as a result, nearly their entire country has been occupied with next to no effort. When Stockholm falls, Christopher will enforce upon the Swedes an immense loss with the intention to release some fiefdoms in Geatland, which will ensure that there's a large buffer of territory to keep Denmark safe. How likely is it that any AI would ever be smart enough to potentially land in Sweden to backdoor my empire? Pretty much impossible, but it works nicely with my roleplay anyway. I conquered all of Geatland and split it into two vassals. West Geatland, in charge of which I put Elżbieta Piast. Like I said before, she'd have been better picked for Danzig, but oh well. Consider this Swedish vassal to be her vacation home. The eastern half of Sweden I gave to Erich von Tetau, who was a random guy I had used as a general a couple of times. It would have been really funny, I think, to instead have put Agata Tyszkiewicz in charge, so that both of my Swedish vassals could be ruled by Polish people, but it's another small RP misplay I made. Unfortunately, even if the vassal's ruler is Polish, the nation will still be Swedish. Otherwise, it would be truly hilarious to pray that the Polish vassal AI would want to assimilate the Pops in Sweden, and we'd have a weird Polish settlement of Geatland, acting as a vast barrier between the Danes and Swedes who can't stand each other. Anyway, by this point, Christopher had turned 30 and has 6 kids. Wow, yeah, I forgot to mention that apparently this guy is great at pumping kids out. That marriage I had to that Catalan princess from Athens ended because she died or something, and unfortunately she died before inheriting Athens, so that potentially cursed union didn't happen. Our current wife is from Holland, but of a French dynasty, so nothing super interesting. One thing I do find funny about the idea of a Danish-Athenian union is that in real life, the von Wittelsbach family ruled in both Denmark and Greece at different periods of time, so it's possible that had I ended up with a union between Denmark and Athens, it could have been some kind of weird reference to that German family's rule of both nations or something. In December 1378, I embraced banking, which is an okay institution, but I'm definitely still more interested in Renaissance. For whatever reason, it's taking forever to get over here. Shortly after looking at that, I went to get my daughter married and saw I could pick Scotland, so immediately I went for that, thinking I'd see an incestuous list of Estrids appear, but I was disappointed to see that the historical Scottish Stuart dynasty was in power there. I'm pretty sure this is some kind of event-spawned ruler change that caused this because my cousin Christopher was the rightful heir to Scotland. Unfortunately, I didn't exactly have my eyes on Scotland in all this time, so how Charles Stuart here got in power I don't know, but my best guess is an event or a coup or something. Rip the dream of Estrids in Scotland. To resolve the disappointment, I went to war with the Hansa by attacking one of their vassals in Holstein. Now, the Hansa is a very interesting tag in EU5 in that building-based countries such as the Hansa can't really ever be destroyed, but they can have vassals. That means that I can't really occupy the Hansa, but when I attack any of their subjects, those subjects more or less become the actual defenders in the war. The Hansa was allied to Austria, who you might think I'd be scared of, but in reality, my plan is to blitz down Lübeck and Holstein before the Austrians can get here, and hope that I can get out of the war before Austria and the Hansa's vassals can form up against me. The overconfident Hanseatic League sent their vassals' men to Flensburg, thinking they'd have an easy time with Austrian backup. Upon seeing the horde of Danes approaching them, they fled to Schleswig, and they were easily defeated, but too cowardly to engage in a proper pitched battle. From there, the army marched on Kiel and Lübeck, neither of which had any forts. Yeah, that's pretty good for me since these cities are the ones I'm really looking to take more than anything. I got all the occupations I wanted by September of 1380, but the Hansa wouldn't give up easily, knowing that Austria's soldiers would surely arrive soon. That they did in November, but it turns out these Austrians are not well versed in war, and they were slaughtered in Stormarn. A few months after that battle, the Hansa had to admit defeat and give up control over all their territory in and around Lübeck. Now this is a major achievement for Christopher's reign. The city of Lübeck is extremely important as it's the market center for the region, and it also has a pretty high population and a well-established, urbanized build-up already. Once the city is integrated, and of course assimilated to proper Danish culture, it will be a great source of wealth. With this achievement, Christopher has completed his plans for Baltic dominance, and although there is certainly still a lot of land along the Baltic coast to seize, he's quite happy with his current progress. Rather than pigeonhole himself into just the Baltic, he considered the other ambitions his realm could pursue. One day, although it may indeed be a long time in the future, the Danes will cross the North Sea and return England to its list of territories, and to help with that, have they aligned themselves with the Scots. Nonetheless, more firepower may prove necessary. The kingdoms of Denmark and France entered an alliance in June of 1382, with Denmark offering to France an answer to its woes at the hands of the English navy. A couple years after that, I finished the conquest of Holstein, by the way, as this little tag on the eastern back of the Elbe estuary had no allies, but also wasn't vassalized by the Hansa or anything. You'd think the emperor would protect the princes, but EU5 is a strange game. Looking at my coalition map mode, I probably could continue conquering more land in North Germany without much bother, but instead I'm thinking that westward focus on England sounds more attractive. At this point, I'm going to send this campaign down a pretty significant jump in time. You see, the truth is, building up enough strength to go fight England mostly involves building up a navy and army, and that involves integrating my conquered locations, building up my cities, and more or less engaging in the parts of the game which are a million times more fun to play than to watch. King Christopher is someone that has based his reign on conquest so far. However, he wants to leave more of a legacy than just one of war and blood. To achieve that, he'd be the king that, in November 1392, introduced the Danes to the Renaissance. Let's talk a little bit about technology at this point. I very rarely show what technologies I'm picking out because I have the unfortunate habit of just queuing up a massive queue of stuff and letting it sit for decades. I'll try to explain my choice of techs in the Renaissance tree at least though, so you can get an idea of my logic. I immediately want the power to invest in art, which is something I don't care about much gameplay-wise, but for my RP I really like having it. I also want government reforms and cabinet seats, as these are the juiciest rewards for most of the institutions. Universities come next, which will let me actually spike my cultural influence as well as giving me another law to pick a policy for. Laws and policies are pretty nice in most cases, so those are another priority after government reforms and cabinet seats. Beyond that, I mean, the art school sounds cool, as does the theater. Then I'll grab one of my unique advancements as Denmark, which gives diplomatic capacity and legitimacy, and of course, the rights of the nobility law. Another excellent advancement in the Renaissance is vibrant court, which gives us access to more accepted cultures. After that, I went to the banking tree to rush for ships. The dock lets you start producing sailors, and the bark is a light ship which gives a lot of maritime presence in sea zones. That means light ships will be important for getting actual control over my overseas territories like in Danzig and eventually England. The protected harbor increases harbor capacity, which also helps getting proximity and control overseas. After that, I grabbed a couple miscellaneous techs that have some nice modifiers like a maritime presence tech, and then, as I continue to slide to the right, you can see what techs from the professional army tree that I took. I'm very sorry that that's not exactly an in-depth look at the institutions and all their technologies, but I just don't tend to have a ton to say about how I choose tech. I go for critically important stuff like reforms and cabinet seats, then for laws and policies, and then maybe for buildings or units, and finally, miscellaneous modifiers sound interesting. Here's King Christopher in December of 1392, by the way. He's got great traits, except that apparently towards the end of his reign, he became an embezzler. You hate to see it. Feeling that his time as a king may soon be ending, as his health has started to take a downward turn, Christopher got to annexing Danzig and traveled to Lübeck, now called Lübeck. The spelling is different, but the Danish pronunciation is actually a nearly perfect transliteration of the German pronunciation. I found out after agonizing over how to read Danish. The king also sent his cabinet to assimilate the Holsatian Germans to Danish culture, which we'll call the natural migration of peasants from Denmark into Holstein, rather than some kind of strongly government-run attempt at wiping out the Holsatians. Shortly after, in February of 1396, King Christopher III passed away, leaving behind a legacy of something greater for Denmark than mere redemption. In the hands of his son, Valdemar V, is the goal of destroying England and bringing about a new era of Danish dominance in the North Sea. Now, the issue is that Valdemar has his own idea about where he'd like to see the Danish people go. He is less interested in England, which will be difficult to properly control and deeply costly to defeat. Sure, it would really revive Danish pride to secure the North Sea, but more pragmatically speaking, there are more accessible and more beneficial paths to pursue. Especially is Valdemar V concerned with his birthright in Poland. Up to now, actual interactions between Poland and Denmark at a national level have been nearly non-existent, but the ruling families, the Estrids and Piasts, have developed a close relationship thanks to the work Elžbieta put in to keep Denmark on the straight and narrow, and Denmark's work to weaken the Teutonic Order in return. It might sound a bit like a betrayal, but Valdemar is thinking that, via the port of Danzig, he can perhaps assert his claim to the Polish throne, whose support in future conflicts he would prefer be obligated rather than promised. Those plans, of course, will remain completely secret until the time is right. Instead, Valdemar is going to wipe up a little more of the nuisances on his border. The Hanseatic city of Hamburg is almost as, if not perhaps even more important than Lübeck. However, to attack it would feel like a waste of a parliament session. So instead, Valdemar asked the parliament to invade Norway, whose alliance with the Hansa will see Hamburg enter the war. The true goal of this war against the Norwegians is indeed to claim Hamburg, but since war has broken out, what harm can there be in a little northern conquest? The army first went south and immediately assaulted Hamburg, occupying the city and waiting for a Hanseatic response. The same would happen in Oslo, where literal thousands of Danish lives were thrown away only so that Valdemar could have the castles occupied faster. The sort of noble, high-minded goals of Christopher to restore a lost empire and bring pride to the Danes was very much so contrasted to Valdemar's cold military acumen. In November of 1401, I made peace with Norway, taking their coastline along the eastern Skagerrak, including Oslo, and of course, Hamburg, one of the most important Hanseatic cities. In charge of Oslo, I put Elizabeth Estridsdatter, Valdemar's sister, and in good time, we'll integrate Oslo and eventually call it a proper part of Denmark. Alongside that, the Bohemian Hussite heresy spawned in March of 1402, and I promise I'm mentioning this because it will be relevant. Let it be noted that Valdemar's current wife, Marketa, is a Bohemian princess, in case you're wondering how it might come up. A little while after, in February of the following year, I unlocked universities, and the first one I built was in Roskilde. This university, the first of its kind in not just Denmark but Scandinavia in general, would be named, and please prepare yourself for my attempt at some Danish here, Det Kongelige Estrid Collegium, or KEK for short. I didn't realize its name would end up being a meme until after I thought of it, and decided to just go with it. In case anyone that watches my videos ever wonders what I do to pronounce things in languages I don't know, I just convert them to IPA if possible and then read the IPA. Perks of a linguistics education, folks. That being said, pretty sure I butchered the Danish there. That's a tough language to pronounce. Anyway, the purposes of these universities above all is to make cultural influence. They do also provide literacy, institution growth, and pop promotion speed, all of which are quite nice, especially given literacy increases production efficiency. Basically, universities are goated. The creation of this university, or rather the beginning of its construction I suppose, coincided with Denmark's crossing into humanist values. For a while now we've been quite innovative, but the move towards humanism is a relatively recent trend. To further that wave of humanism, the Kingdom of Denmark gave the KEK University its first task, to make a school curriculum for the common people. Although limited in scope and accessibility, King Valdemar granted to the whole island of Zealand a right to attend schooling. That might sound opposite to Valdemar's previously cruel behavior with the sieges and stuff before, but remember, he's not cruel, he's more callous than anything. Education will serve the nation, as through higher literacy rates the kingdom will gain an economic advantage over its competition thanks to the production efficiency bonus from literacy. Also, education of the people gives more humanist and innovative drift. It does cost some loyalty from the nobles and clergy, which is painful, but still worth it for sure. So far, King Valdemar has, despite his controversial military decisions, been well hailed in Denmark as yet another in a line of successful kings. He's not just a militarist, but he's also a king who has brought to the masses education and economic opportunity. Now, though, he would cash in on that goodwill and tell his people to prepare for war. This will not be an easy one, nor will it be something of particular interest to Danish people or realm. No, this is a personal project. The kingdoms of Hungary and Poland have, through some kind of poorly planned marriage, ended up in a union under Queen Johanna Synacuris. The name certainly isn't Hungarian, but the senior partner in the union is Hungary, and Queen Johanna has adopted Hungarian culture, meaning technically I should be calling her Synacuris Johanna, I guess. Obviously, the dethroning of the Piast family has resulted in at least some of the Polish nobility starting a search to find the real heir that can overthrow the shackles of Hungarian dominance. Technically, one such Piast descendant, albeit a matrilineal one, is Valdemar through his grandmother Elżbieta Piast. The number of Polish nobles willing to support Valdemar's claim is far too small for him to possibly garner any military support from the Poles, most of whom will likely be drafted into the Hungarian cause, but in truth, even the combined Hungarian and Polish army is no match for Denmark's battle-hardened force. A massive army and fleet assembled at Copenhagen and set sail for Danzig, where a mere scouting party of Poles were attempting to take the city. Being the smart cookie that I am, compared to the Teutons, I put a fort in Danzig, so that this important hub in the Baltics can't just be immediately taken by anyone at will. I should also mention that Danzig changed names to Gdańsk at some point, which is the Polish name for the city. I believe this is because I integrated it and the name defaults to Gdańsk if a non-German controls it. Personally, I think that Denmark will continue using the Germanic name, not the Slavic one, so I'm going to keep referring to it as Danzig despite it being Gdańsk on the map. Not going for any political takes here, just doing what I think would fit the RP best. After defeating some Polish forces and occupying a handful of villages to resupply on food, the Danish army returned to Danzig to find the main Hungarian force. The Battle of Danzig began on August 15th of 1405, and it saw a pitched battle where the Hungarian soldiers were woefully unprepared for combat against the significantly better equipped and trained Danish soldiers. Each tick, I'm losing just over 100 men, while the Hungarians are losing over 700. Now, EU5 has been getting a nearly continuous cascade of patches which have been changing and rebalancing regulars and levies over and over, so it's hard to comment on exactly why I was destroying the Hungarians so hard here, but for whatever reason, it was happening. Most of my army is currently made up of levies, so I really couldn't tell you. The Hungarians tried to escape but got caught out during their retreat as they were slowed by their siege equipment, which they tried to take back home. What happened here is that Hungary got caught in Danzig's zone of control, and that means they can't actually leave. I think normally they'd be always allowed to move into territory that they control, but because they are Hungary and not Poland, there's no actual land that they control which borders any land here in Danzig, thus they get stack wiped, although the after battle report doesn't show it. You can see clearly though that there is no longer a Hungarian army here. Next is the Polish army and some of the Hungarian minor vassals that have been on their way to relieve the Hungarian siege. The Poles fought a little better than the Hungarians, but still were slaughtered at the Battle of Świecie. We can see that over 5,000 Poles lost their lives to claim just 2,000 Danish lives, and so Valdemar continued the campaign knowing he'd need to take Kraków if he wanted to possibly claim the throne. His military advisors warned of the difficulty of supply lines and the possibility that many men could lose their fighting spirit or even their lives to the hostile weather of a Polish winter. To that, Valdemar simply told them, "You understand we're Danes, right? How bad could a Polish winter be?" And so, by January 1406, the army reached Kraków, with the Poles cutting down the supply trains from Danzig, resulting in exactly the starvation that the advisors predicted. The men, fearing death by starvation, looked to their king for guidance. Valdemar pointed at the fort and told them there's food in there, and so the assault began. Kraków fell in August of 1406, resulting in several thousand dead Danes, but ultimately, a victory, if it can be called that. The army marched back to Danzig, ravaging many villages along the way, until the Poles finally accepted a peace deal in December that year. Now, the antagonism this generated was kind of insane, but that's fine. Now that Valdemar V of Denmark and First of Poland has united the thrones, it would be a tough battle for even the great powers of Europe to fend him off, not to mention, Denmark and France are still staunch allies. Thanks to this union, I can talk a little bit about personal union mechanics now. Essentially, as time goes on, we can add centralization or decentralization laws to the union which restrict or maintain the autonomy of our junior members. In pretty much all cases that I can think of, you'll want to rein in your union members so you can eventually integrate them, but if you're trying to be a little more friendly with your union members and maybe form some kind of strange federation, you could keep it decentralized. The first and probably most important policy to get through is the unified succession system, which ensures that your PUs don't just pick a different ruler when your monarch dies. It should be noted though that even with this law, the PU can break if the heir to a kingdom is completely disqualified, such as if their faith is ineligible to rule. This is where the mention of Hussite's appearance becomes relevant. I didn't realize until I saw that we had misaligned heirs, but it turns out that while Valdemar was on his campaign in Poland, his wife Markéta had been teaching little Christopher the ways of Jan Hus, meaning the only legal heir to Poland from Valdemar's line would be Yolande, who kept to her Catholic ways. Indeed, it turns out Markéta had made all the kids Hussites in Valdemar's absence. Now, this probably won't have any especially crazy implications for the game, since your ruler's faith isn't as important as your nation's faith, but it does mean that my union with Poland is tenuous due to the aforementioned faith requirements for Poland's succession. Thankfully, there's a PU policy which forces the junior partner to adopt the laws of the senior, and that includes their succession laws, which will see Poland allow any faith on their throne. Assuming Valdemar lives long enough for it, he'll be able to pass that law and allow little Christopher to legally hold the Polish throne. Voting for laws in PUs is pretty easy at first because votes are calculated based on your great power score, and assuming that you're the senior member, you have more great power score, as seniority is determined by that number. If there are only 2 crowns in a union, then the senior wins all votes by default. Where this gets more complicated is if you start putting many crowns into one union, in which case enough disgruntled members could potentially outvote the senior member. I had the perfect timing for a flavor event after the war with Poland, by the way. Although I'd conquered these cities years ago, I got an event in March of 1407 about my defeat of the Hansa. It gives me a bunch of loyalty, some power projection, and trade efficiency for a bit. Very nice. I spent the money on more universities, of course. One overlooked aspect of my invasion of Poland is something which is unfortunately pretty meaningless mechanically, but super interesting RP-wise, is the theft of art. Looking over my art in June of 1408, we see lots of Danish stuff, but also Polish stuff, like the Historia Polonica, a chronicle about Poland's myth and legends. We've also got the Gesta Principum Polonorum. I've also got the famous Sterbiec sword, which is a royal coronation sword for Poland. I find it very interesting to imagine the Danish crown jewel is just adorned with these extra Polish bits to signify the connection between the two realms. I also love to imagine the impact this might have on the Polish nobility and people who have lost many of their beloved relics. Mechanically, this is just about nothing, giving a tiny little boost to cultural assimilation and influence, but again, the RP is totally worth it. I'm crossing my fingers for an art-oriented DLC one day. Come on, Paradox, make it happen. Rather than garishly display these Polish artifacts with the Danish regalia, Valdemar put them with his grandmother Elżbieta's tomb, and essentially made a Polish wing of the castle, dedicated to his beloved grandmother, and recounting the liberation of Poland from the Hungarian tyrants that removed the legitimate Piast family. With the Union established and the Polish regalia claimed, Valdemar has retained his birthright, and although a confused change in priorities, there are still many people in Denmark that are looking west to the British Isles. In fact, I'm actually at war with England right now, but it's as an ally of France, and they use the 100 Years' War casus belli, which disables taking any locations outside of France, meaning even if I were to land in England and occupy enough stuff to make a separate peace, I wouldn't be allowed to take anything except maybe Calais. By right of his absolute authority over the two great kingdoms of Europe, Valdemar curtailed the rights of his petty nobles, seeking to put more power into his own hands. Some say he's going a bit mad, but others say it's his strong leadership that has allowed Denmark to gain so much power. The question is if his heirs will be able to maintain it. In terms of how to ensure success for his heirs, Valdemar knows that continuous war and expansion may actually have a deeply opposite effect compared to what he wants. Now that Denmark has expanded so vigorously, it's time to look inwards, and after seeing the grand cities of Poland and the Hansa, Valdemar realized that his kingdom is a bit of a backwater. København and Roskilde are the jewels of the Danish crown, but they're both relatively minor towns. Alongside that, the people living in the actual cities of his kingdom, the people of Lübeck and Hamburg, are Germans. In better news, the Denmark-Poland Union implemented aligned legislature in December of 1410, meaning the fears of a Hussite Catholic divergence in the crowns will be assuaged. Poland will be forced to allow heretics on their throne. The final policy to implement is the question of unification, which of course is about integration. Naturally, we'll be seeking to one day integrate Poland, but it might take a very long time to do so. Focusing back on urbanization, I set my cabinet to encourage migration into Copenhagen so that I can actually get enough people there to make a city, and because if I intend to build even more stuff there, then having more people means they can actually employ up for the buildings. By the way, thanks to Danish's immense cultural influence, pretty much all of Schleswig-Holstein is Danish as of May of 1413. Not quite all of it, but a pretty big chunk for sure. The thing is that I already accept Holsatians, so this isn't as huge as it would be if this were a discriminated culture, but it's still nice because it'll reduce how much cultural capacity the Holsatians cost me to accept. From there, an interesting but also kind of useful bug occurred. One of the policies on a union is to limit the diplomatic ability of the junior partners, which is to say, it treats them like vassals. They can't make allies or start wars and so on. I have the policy for that enabled, and yet, Poland declared war on the Teutonic Order in July of 1414. Now, that's no big deal for me because quite frankly, I'm happy to help Poland expand, but technically, I don't think this should be allowed according to our union policies. Oh well. The castle of Marienburg fell in February of 1416, and in terms of what I want out of this war, I'm more or less just hoping Poland will eat a big chunk out of the Teutons and gain some power for themselves. So long as Poland's great power score is below mine, I'm quite happy to see them gaining power. After saving up a bunch of money, Valdemar finally granted Copenhagen a city charter and paid for the immense costs of renovating the city. He asked the architects to base the designs on the two influences his realm has taken in, Poland and the Hanseatic cities. Now, I unfortunately don't actually know very much at all about what medieval or early modern Hanseatic or Polish city design is like, but whatever those are like, imagine them combined into one. That is the style of Copenhagen's new urban layout. I believe this will be Scandinavia's first city in the game, as I doubt Norway or Sweden have saved up the money to turn their towns into cities, and although the best way to assert dominance over my Scandinavian rivals would be to conquer them, I think this is also an appropriate way of showing them who's boss. Anyway, the Teutonic War ended in March of 1417 when Poland made a peace deal, taking pretty much all of Prussia off the Teutons, and then giving me some random locations in Livonia and Wolgast. In Wolgast, I put Margareta, Estrid's daughter, in charge of a new vassal there. I don't know what I'll ever use this land for, but it could be a nice beachhead for future invasion of Pomerania. As for Tukum, I just sold it back to the Livonian Order. I really don't want to think about a tiny village off in the Regan countryside. They bought it for 60 ducats, which is fine, I suppose. Here's some of my culture conversion projects off in Lübeck and Hamburg, by the way. Almost 200 new Danes every month in each location, which is pretty nice. A little after that, Copenhagen's upgrade to a city completed, and with it, we now have a city location with full control. This will be a great boon to the economy. I keyed up a bunch of paper and guns, which I chose for the profits, of course, but also because a lot of my spending lately has been on books, paper, and weapons from my universities and armories. If I can reduce the cost of these goods, then I will both make money on the profits of those buildings and offset some of the expense of buying those goods for my buildings. Anyway, the following year, Valdemar saw an opportunity to push a claim to the Brandenburg throne, which I know I haven't mentioned any marriage relationship with. And that's because, well, quite frankly, I've got so many kids and siblings who I'm just sort of marrying to whoever that I didn't even realize I'd set myself up to acquire the Brandenburg throne. Looks like Austria won't even help poor Brandenburg, and so I declared war to add another throne to my list. Thanks to Poland, getting into Germany is super easy, and the overwhelming power of our two crowns laid waste to Berlin. The war ended in October of 1420, with Valdemar claiming the throne of Berlin. Now, having multiple union members means there's opportunity for each member to have a different integration level. The way we fix that is by hosting a union parliament, where we have to bribe the estates of a union member that's out of line in order to catch them up. The patch I was on had a broken UI where the parliament button was blank, very funny. Nonetheless, you can click it. Taking Brandenburg on as a union member had an interesting downstream effect. In July of 1421, I got an event which unlocked access to a chivalric union, but the flavor text reads as if this Order of the Swan is a Brandenburg thing. I looked up the Order of the Swan and it is real. It was founded in 1440 by Brandenburg. Somehow though, the Order of the Swan is now a Danish institution, and I suspect that is because I put Brandenburg in a union. So that's cool, we've got our own chivalric order now. In checking out the order modifier, I saw that Valdemar was excommunicated, and I haven't even noticed that, by the way. Silly Pope getting involved in North European affairs. I figure this is more about the fact that Valdemar is harboring Hussite heretics in his family, if anything, though. In March of 1422, I got to assimilating Danzig, which up to now I've let stay Prussian. Even without any cabinet pressure, almost 2,500 Danes have appeared in Danzig, which is thanks to the very slow, passive assimilation my nation has. Nonetheless, by adding a cabinet member to the task, almost 150 Prussians will become Danes every month. I pointed it out in the Florence video, but it is truly impressive to me how fast a nation that focuses on it can culture convert, and it's jarring compared to playing Victoria 3, that's for sure. Since this chapter is focused on economic growth and the like, here's a peek at the realm's income as of April of 1425. Most of the money is from the peasants and burghers, of course, and honestly, trade is playing a relatively small role in comparison. Nonetheless, the balance is over 40 ducats, and that's a pretty nice place to be at. Keep in mind, this is while I'm maximally spending on stability, which is expensive. I should thus also add that I'm using the parliament to increase taxes, so once that bonus wears off, I'll be something more like 20 to 30 ducats of income. Still a solid number. With the rise of Copenhagen as the heart of Baltic commerce and the slow degradation of Lübeck's role, Valdemar moved the market capital north to Copenhagen. This is important because it'll increase the market access in our most important locations, and thanks to that, the realm's income jumped from 23 ducats in 1 month to over 30 in 1 month. That's purely because so much of our economic output is in Roskilde and Copenhagen. I lowered my stability spending shortly after because I really want more money, which I can invest into more buildings and a larger regular army. Like I mentioned earlier, the balance and patches for levies and regulars are in constant flux, so no comment as to which set of units are better, given that the modifiers and levy combat change as easily as the wind. Having urbanized and revamped Danish society, Valdemar, now quite an old king, passed away in March of 1429. He would be remembered with mixed feelings, as his wars left Denmark with many war widows, but it can't be denied that Denmark's position in the world was quite well elevated on account of those losses. He integrated Polish and German culture heavily into Danish society as well, and as the founder of the Dano-Polish Union, he even added Brandenburg to the list of Estrid titles. His heir is Christopher IV, continuing the pattern of only having Christophers and Valdemars in the royal line. Christopher is relatively competent, but his big divergence from Valdemar is that he's a Hussite. Here's our culture map as of November of 1430. Pretty much all the Holsatians are gone, and even Danzig and the Danish enclave there are entirely Danish. I like to imagine that if this were Crusader Kings 3, this would mean that the duchies of Schleswig, Holstein, and Danzig, or whatever they'd be called in that game, would be de jure drifted into the Kingdom of Denmark, implying that Danzig is not part of the Scandinavian cultural sphere directly. Despite my best efforts at maintaining peace, Bohemia attacked Poland in August the following year, and that's a foe I really don't want to fight. Bohemia is extremely powerful in EU5. Nonetheless, I want to at least try and protect Poland, whose land is, in a way, my land. Unfortunately, the Danish army was caught out in bad formation during a siege in Silesia. I need to point out one of my frustrations with EU5 here, which is that armies don't automatically rebalance their units into flanks. That means that my entire army was all in the center flank because I forgot to click the balance button, and thus the Bohemians double flanking me and killing thousands of soldiers every day. So yes, the Bohemians lost 300 men to kill 5,000, and it's because sometimes I hate this game. Rather than waste my time on that war, I decided to leave Poland to her fate and invaded Scotland in January 1434. I like to think that every time a Christopher comes to the throne, we refocus on the North Sea, and when a Valdemar comes to power, we refocus on Europe and the Baltic Sea. I wasn't intending it to be that way, but it just kinda ended up that way. Christopher, with this war, has announced his intention to re-implement a proper Danelaw and rule Britain just as the Danes have always been destined to. Christopher's forces landed in Edinburgh in April, but then, much to my immense chagrin, France joined Scotland in the war. This is because the two were indeed allied, but when I declared the war, France said they wouldn't join. I suppose something changed which resulted in them being willing to join now. So obviously, I can't fight France. I'm going to sign a separate peace with them once a year passes, and pretty much give them whatever they ask for and hope it's not too painful. I was able to get away with liberating just Östra Småland, which if we're being honest, only exists because I wanted a barrier between myself and Sweden. Even if they become independent, the barrier is still there, at least for now. After occupying Roxburgh and Galloway, the war came to an end, as Scotland knew that without French support, they were doomed. Christopher cleaved Scotland in half, taking the southern portion and leaving the Scots to rule their highlands. This overseas possession of Denmark will become known as the Scottish Danelaw colloquially, but officially it's the Danish lowlands, in reference to the contrast with the highlands still held by Scotland. With this acquisition of land, England had better start sweating. The Danes have returned and they're back with a vengeance. The momentum of war against the Scots carried immediately into a war with England, and I called in France to help as England allied with Castile. The ensuing conflict, a battle between England and Castile against Denmark, Poland, and France, is perhaps one of the largest conflicts of Europe as yet, but I believe in our armies and the power of Denmark's peasants to outclass English levies. The first fort to breach is Berwick, which sits right next to Roxburgh. Interestingly, the English armies seem busy fighting in France, leaving their northern border open to me. For how long they'll tolerate Danish raids in Northumbria, we'll see, but Berwick, the bastion holding us back from York, fell in July of 1436. It was then that a cursory English army arrived, perhaps thinking Denmark would be a weak enemy to quickly defeat. The Battle of Berwick saw thousands of Englishmen slaughtered, and then was followed up by the Battle of Durham, where another 1,000 were slain. The English really do love sending tiny little armies to see if they can free some of their locations, and it's costing them a whole lot of men. Despite Denmark's focus on the war, the rest of the world was focused on the new era of discovery, which began in 1437. The Danes haven't taken much interest in discovering new worlds when they still have old ones to conquer, but the innovations that come out of whatever the others discover could be of great interest one day to the crown. In terms of hegemons, we can see that as usual France is absolutely dominating, thank goodness for allies. Anyway, I continued the warpath south until I hit Leeds, which is yet another fort. I tried to assault it but got kinda destroyed. Seeing that my army was weakened, the English sent a proper fighting force to try and kick me off of Leeds in July of 1437. This army was much scarier, but still not enough to win. That being said, my army is being worn down, mostly by my own poor decision making, but worn down it is nonetheless. This resulted in yet another English army arriving in September, and this time they did win, relieving Leeds of the siege and making me consider peace. I decided to not get greedy and took a peace deal that carved a line down from Berwick into York, ensuring I took one of the forts near Leeds. This is certainly not a total domination or decisive victory, but it is a victory and one that proves I can defeat England. Rather than governing England myself, I released the vassal of Northumberland, who I'm hoping might fabricate some casus bellis against England in the future to save me the headache of a bunch of zero-control locations. Once we get a stronger navy, we'll be able to actually get control over here, but for now, there's nothing to gain besides pride for conquering England directly. Here's a little check-in on my cultural makeup as of December of 1440, by the way. We're a pretty absolute majority Danish thanks to the assimilation efforts that Valdemar put in, but there's quite a sizable Scots minority now off in Scotland. Naturally, once we've got more control there, we'll of course be settling that land with Danes too. Speaking of the Scots, I decided that I'd like to finish off my conquest of them in the summer of 1441. I've got a claimed throne CB, and the throne of Scotland is owed to me after the Stuarts stole it decades ago. Obviously, with Scotland having no allies and having lost its richest land in the previous war, they quickly fell and joined the Union in November of 1442. Peace ruled the Danish crown for some time, until in October of 1444, Christopher, named Iron-Tooth posthumously, passed away, leaving King Valdemar VI to rule the thrones of Denmark, Poland, Brandenburg, Scotland, and somehow Wrocław, which I'm guessing is a fiefdom of Poland. King Valdemar plans to spend the beginning of his reign at peace and to work on settling the lowlands with Danes. He's also building up a navy with the intention of using it to assert enough maritime presence to actually control England once it is conquered. By this point, I've got enough of a navy that I can at the very least assert control over all of Denmark proper, and we can see that via the control map mode, naval proximity is very powerful, but it requires a capital in a good natural harbor and a huge navy to maintain the maritime presence required. It is resulting in a huge income boost though, thanks to all the control, and the additional tax income from control more or less pays for the fleet. Now, Valdemar's peaceful intentions ended up falling apart in March of 1450 when England declared war looking to reclaim Northumberland. I have to be frank here and say that I'm not sure what they're planning. They have a couple little allies in Germany who will pose basically no threat, but they didn't call in Castile or anything. In a 1v1, I absolutely beat England, especially since I have Scotland's help now too. I do technically have Poland's help, but obviously the Poles have no navy, so they won't actually be able to get to England to help out. Okay, I kinda lied. England did call in Castile later on, but it was a delayed call for some reason. I would peace out Castile in this war by offering them a sound toll exemption, which is a hilarious thing to do for a nation so far away from the Baltic, but it turns out England used the coalition CB, meaning I can't separate peace anyone. That hurts a lot. While some battles went well and others very poorly, the war was leaning towards Denmark, at least by war score counts. Nonetheless, this war is a waste of time, as I won't be able to fight off England and Castile with just Scotland's help, and this coalition CB makes it hard to isolate England, so I did end up surrendering. I gave England a sound toll exemption and 160 ducats to go away. They accepted. So let me just get this out of the way. The sound toll exemption treaty is ridiculously strong because the AI always wants it and it's worth 50 war score. The thing is that sound tolls make, in grand total, maybe like 10 ducats for me, and giving just one nation an exemption might take away a ducat or two. Now, giving away a sound toll exemption once does trigger an event which takes away some prestige and destroys your castle in Copenhagen, but well, who cares? I just built up the castle again and went on with my life. Here's a breakdown of my trade income to give you an idea of how little I care about giving out sound toll exemptions, by the way. Also, I went to check on the Ottomans, I just want to see how the AI is doing, and they converted to Orthodox, which is funny, but then the conversion actually kind of made sense when I checked the ruler. Somehow, the king of the Ottomans is Andrei Krasnostavsky, a Volhynian Christian who is also conveniently my distant cousin. I don't know how this guy got on the throne, but one little rant I have to go on, is about the naming of the Ottomans. The Ottomans are named for the Osmanlı dynasty, which is the house of all the Ottoman sultans and padishahs since their inception. Having this nation be called the Ottomans, even if their ruler is not an Ottoman, is kind of nonsensical. I don't know if it should be changed, since it would probably be confusing if the tag suddenly had a new name, but I'm just saying, Andrei Krasnostavsky should change the name of his kingdom to the Krasnostavskys or something, instead of taking on the name of the old dynasty's family. By the way, looking at the character history of the Ottoman rulers, it looks like the way this happened was via Çakazade Bey having no sons, and allowing his daughter Esin Begum to inherit. She presumably married a Greek or something, but also had no sons, resulting in Joanna Begum coming to power, and then another Turkish woman came to power, Şerap Begum, and she is the mother of King Andrei. EU5 really needs matrilineal marriages to prevent the fact that ever having a female ruler means the end of your lineage, but I guess the game isn't CK3, so losing your family isn't as big of a deal. Back to Denmark now, here's my income as of April of 1456. I know we skipped a few years, but all I'm doing is building up my army, navy, and cities. The breakdown of my tax base shows where I've been building, but of course Copenhagen and Roskilde are the clear leaders of the nation's economy, alongside, surprisingly, Danzig. Shortly after that, Poland once again attacked the Teutons, and I went to support them. This war is insanely easy by this point, as the Teutons have lost all their good land. Poland peaced out in April of 1458, taking even more land and reducing the Teutons to a speck on the Baltic coast. I was checking on the culture map mode after, and I saw that the Catalans settled in Athens. That's pretty funny, I won't lie. Finally, in November of 1459 did I get a proper chance to invade England. Castile is rejecting the call to arms, as is Aragon, and all England has is the Hansa and the Papal State. King Valdemar, a Hussite like his father, does not care about what the Pope thinks, and so declared war. He told his men that in this campaign they will take London, and they will return Denmark to her rightful place as Lord of the North Sea. The men cheered and boarded their ships ready to sack England. The fort of Leeds is once again a thorn in my side, as it sits on good terrain for the English and refuses to crumble, nor is it worth assaulting. After many battles on the fort, with some of them going my way, some of them not, Leeds, the gateway to southern England, fell in June of 1463. With that, the army ravaged the richest parts of eastern England, and then in August of 1464, the English did surrender, giving up all of Northumberland's cores and handing control of Lincoln, East Anglia, Kent, Essex, and even Calais to Denmark. Upon signing the treaty, Valdemar returned to Copenhagen and hung up the piece of paper, naming it the Treaty of the New Danelaw. With every war the English lose, they become more and more vulnerable to further war, and this is exactly Valdemar's plan. He's been building up his navy for a long time, and his army has drilled hard to defeat the powerful English longbows, and now, will all that work finally pay off? A thalassocracy is a realm ruled by the sea, in the sense that the nation's heart and soul exist along its maritime connections between a few centers of power. Denmark has embodied this idea in recent years with outposts in Edinburgh, Hamburg, Danzig, Oslo, and of course Copenhagen. It's quite necessary then that Denmark secure powerful natural harbors. Places like Copenhagen, Hamburg, Danzig, Edinburgh, etc. are powerful natural harbors that are very good at spreading proximity overseas. But in England, I don't really have a good harbor. There's Kent, which is okay, but London is the real prize. Nonetheless, a harbor isn't enough to make a thalassocracy. We need a navy, and we do already have one, but we need a giant navy, a deluge of light ships that can assert Danish sovereignty from the Baltic to the Firth of Forth. Thus, there are two more goals before we can call this North Sea Empire complete: the conquest of London, and a powerful enough navy to keep the maritime presence up. There's one really massive, horrible, gigantic, awful wrench that has been thrown into this plan, though, and that is the conclusion of the 100 Years' War with a French victory. Yeah, surprise. Turns out, just after I conquered the east coast of England, the French got themselves into a union with England, so far with no senior partner established. This is going to be a problem, but at least I'm allied with France, which does give me some ways to weasel out of this issue. Also, I should add that the 100 Years' War isn't actually over until one of them does in fact assert seniority, so now we have this cursed UI where the same king is sitting on both sides of the conflict. Since we haven't looked at it in a while, here are my values. I haven't shown it off much because more or less all of them have stayed about the same for the past while. The big change recently is the shift to centralization. In terms of an income check, here's what we've got in April of 1468. Still reliant on the burghers, peasants, and trade of course, but I can actually maintain a pretty good shot of stability and diplomatic spending with this income. It feels good. This isn't even with parliament-approved taxes on. A huge part of what's generating the burgher tax revenue is the advent of the printer's shops in Copenhagen that I unlocked with the printing press. Just look at those profits per building and the production efficiency on it. As you unlock better versions of buildings like printer shops and other stuff, your economy will supercharge in EU5 since higher building tiers are absolutely insanely powerful. I want to show off something funny as well. Looking at my culture setup, we can see that with this one conquest or just a portion of England, English pops now make up a third of my entire population. Accepting them would be nice, but the cost to my cultural capacity would not be acceptable. Anyway, I was spending a lot of time at this point just pondering how I could possibly take down this Franco-English union, so in that time, I sent my navy out to increase maritime presence and I built up Roskilde and Copenhagen more and more. Then something interesting happened. In May of 1472, the English and French went to war, despite being ruled by the same king. So listen, I love roleplay and trying to explain in a historiographical sense what's happening in the game. In this case, yeah, I have no idea. My best explanation is that although the French king is the king of England, the English administration is hostile to him and the local nobility and burghers are leading a war against the French kingdom, perhaps to gain freedom or something. It doesn't make sense because if that were the case, you'd think they'd elevate some Englishman to be king in place of Francis, rather than accepting the French king as their king, but refusing to cooperate with the French administration. Where this got even funnier was when France called on me to honor my alliance. I'll be helping the French king to defeat himself in the 100 Years' War, I guess. I have nothing to gain from this war, but I wanted to help out anyway just for the fun of this wacky scenario. While the schizophrenic war for England waged by France on itself continued, I looked at the tax-based map mode to see how Copenhagen's 100 tax base compared. The world is looking quite red and black, but some spots in Bohemia and France seem to be doing well. Afterwards, I took a white peace with England because, as I mentioned, there's nothing to gain from this war due to the CB chosen by France. Since I'm making all this money with the advent of the printing press, I decided to further the urbanization efforts of Denmark that I'd started some decades ago. I've granted city rights to Odense and Roskilde, as well as town rights to Nakskov. The reasoning behind these locations is almost entirely based on population and value of RGOs. If the RGO is good, we want to keep it rural so we don't lose RGO size, but if the RGO is bad and population is high, then that's a prime opportunity for a bunch of burghers and nobles to add to our economy. Remember that burghers and nobles are the primary generators of demand for goods in a market, so if you want your building to stay profitable, you need a lot of them. Around 1476, I'm hitting the point in the game where I'm really becoming flush with money, and it feels very fun. Where previously every building and every ducat was a well thought out decision, I'm now kind of just spamming out whatever and reaping the benefits of it. The rich get richer in EU5 and we're getting a lot richer. Want to see a cursed union, by the way? This is the Norwegian Union of Norway, Sweden, Flanders, a vassal state of France by the way, and Rethel. Norway has just been playing CK3 over here with all this peaceful union making. Indeed, the union was so cursed that upon seeing it, King Valdemar keeled over dead. Well, okay, that was 2 years later, but it's funny to imagine the two things are connected. In his place has come, you guessed it, Christopher V. Christopher is looking for a strong opening to his rule, so of course he asked Parliament for a CB on England, and then looked to declare war. However, he can't attack England if they're in a union with one of his allies. That means that in order to attack England, I'll have to break my alliance with France. The fear, though, is that that might allow France to join the war against me and utterly crush me. At the same time, France and England are still fighting, so if this game follows EU4 logic, then France can't fight me on England's side if they're at war with England. I gambled, broke the alliance with France, and went for it. My tactics seem to have worked, as the French did indeed not join against me. This is wonderful, and it means London will soon be within my grasp. The bad news, of course, is that Castile joined, but in more interesting news, I got this cool event. It looks like we'll suddenly be creating a relatively large collection of Hussite pops, as many of my locations in Britain are below 50% control. Unfortunately, after checking the locations in Britain to see where all my Hussites were, it seemed to be the case that the event simply lied, and most of my locations did not gain any Hussites. Maybe it only meant cores and not conquered locations. That would make sense, I guess, since there were some Hussites in East Anglia, where I did have at least a handful of integrated locations, albeit no cores. Still, because I have any Hussite presence in my nation, I could actually convert to Hussitism now if I wanted to. That being said, I'm good on that for now. Want to see the AI get slaughtered in a battle? Check out the Battle of Hertford against Castile. Despite having double my army size in the battle, Castile is taking upwards of 4 times the casualties. This is an army composed mostly of regulars with some levies sprinkled in, and they've been drilling for years, giving them big bonuses. It always feels good to do a quality-oriented playthrough in my opinion. The battle ended on November 12th of 1480, and with it the Spaniards lost nearly 5,000 souls to my 750 or so. The army I've been ignoring in Windsor did not fare so well. Castile's presence in this war is really irking me, and I'm thinking that I'd like them out of the war. Now, remember those sound toll exemptions I could offer people before? Well, I've actually got an even better thing now. Earlier in the run, I didn't mention it because it was a minor thing, but I made the Hansa a vassal after they were called in as an ally in some war, I forgot which one. Well, now I can offer to shut down Hanseatic cantors for huge war score. The reason the war score is so high is because if you were playing the Hansa, this would be very painful, as the cantors are your main source of power. Well, as Denmark with a little Hansa vassal, I don't care about it. I'm quite happy to pay off Castile to leave this war in return for the destruction of 4 cantors. With Castile gone, I can now focus down England and get London sieged down. To add salt to the wound, even Poland managed to move some troops over to England, meaning that my normally relatively useless Union member is helping to wipe out small stacks for me. Very nice, thank you Poland. After a 311-day siege, London fell in April of 1482, marking the beginning of the end of England in this war. I pushed into the heart of England, and shortly after they accepted a 95% war score deal, which gave me pretty much all their richest land, including the coveted London. It's gonna take forever to integrate all this land, but thankfully, that's what we have an epilogue in this video for. What I mean by that is at this point, I'm feeling pretty done with this run. I've defeated all my major enemies, made some funny memes, and had a ton of fun. It's time to wrap this up. King Christopher V arrived in London after England's surrender of it and surveyed the city. The English people still have a rebellious spirit, but by the sheer volume of people living here and the wealth of the city and its countryside, it made him seriously consider moving the capital over. Of course, even as he arrived in the city, his bodyguards told him to be careful, as he's not exactly well loved here. Shortly after, in October 1483, the English patriots rose up everywhere except London, mostly because the army was drilling there and the Danish military presence kept separatist sentiment down. Very conveniently for me, I had destroyed all the forts in England knowing that this rebellion was coming. It may be expensive to rebuild them after, but it means that this pretty large rebellion off in England will be put down less than half a year after it began. With that, King Christopher understood that he'll need to assert some control over here in England if he really wants to rule. He ordered the vast Danish navy to focus on controlling the seas from Copenhagen to London, and after a while it became commonplace for anyone along the North Sea coast to see Danish ships carrying goods and troops to and fro. By January 1487, London had as much as 43% proximity, adding 30% control to it. Here's the proper control map mode, so you can get an idea of how much control is spreading. In terms of Scandinavia, we've got a ton of control, as keeping maritime presence in such a small area is easy. Meanwhile, England is a bit more red. Sorry you can't see it very well, as while I was checking that map out, the 100 Years' War formally ended, presumably because France made England a junior partner or something, and then I forgot I was showing off control. The North Sea Thalassocracy of Denmark enjoyed peace for a long time, with Christopher V actually passing away in May of 1495, having only fought one war, the War for London. In his place came, and I promise you this is not a meme, Valdemar VII, and his heir is a guy named Christopher. I absolutely promise you I have not been choosing names for any of my kids. It's just been, by total coincidence, a rotation of Valdemars and Christophers the whole game. Like all of his predecessors, Valdemar started off his reign with a show of strength. He attacked Volgast, hoping to secure more of a Baltic coastline to help spread maritime presence to Danzig. He used the fact that the old Danish fiefdom of Ostra-Småland was allied to Volgast to reclaim some lost territory. The war with Volgast ended rather curiously in March of 1498, and I say curiously because Poland refused to hand over occupation of the Volgaster capital, resulting in my taking them as a fiefdom, actually assigning it to Poland. Doing this would actually end up causing Bohemia to declare a coalition war on Poland, who accrued a lot of antagonism by taking on Volgast as a fiefdom. But at this point though, I really am getting tired of this run, so I'm barely trying to defend Poland. What I did discover was being able to use a console command in debug mode to make the game run faster. This option was later added to the actual settings in the game, meaning you don't have to use debug mode for it anymore, but it reinvigorated me a bit to keep playing. The problem with using this forbidden technique is that it makes the game pretty hard to look at as a viewer, given the frame rate falls to like 60 seconds per frame. Regardless, I pushed Bohemia to 47% war score, and then Poland made peace, but I accidentally closed the window showing the deal, so I don't know what they did, but I can see that Bohemia's lost some land, so that's nice. I continued playing a bit longer by this point, focusing on optimizing my maritime presence to eventually, in May of 1507, obtain 66% proximity in London. I've got my cabinet increasing control there and assimilating pops with the hopes of eventually actually coring London and making it a keystone of my economy. In September 1517, the Protestant Reformation began, with Martin Luther pinning his complaints to the Catholic Church in Florence, of all places. In EU4, a Protestant Reformation springing from Italy was unheard of, but in EU5, I've seen it happen now in Spain and in Italy here and there. Pretty cool, I guess. After converting about a quarter of London's Danish culture by January 1515, I ended up calling the run there. I felt by this point I'd accomplished what I wanted to do, and that was to learn how naval mechanics work and make a revived North Sea empire. Technically, I could continue to pursue the reformation of that old empire by conquering more of England and the rest of Norway, but I was quite satisfied with this outcome. My economy is strong, my army is strong, I have several powerful unions, and in terms of RP, this run felt amazing. I want to add at the end here that this video is very long, and that's on account of both the nature of EU5 as a relatively slow-paced game, but also just because the game has enough mechanics and things to look at that I can indeed write to my heart's content, without needing to make too much up. The biggest example of something I love writing about with the roleplay but is ultimately inconsequential in-game is art, of course. I loved capturing those Polish artifacts in terms of the story, but in terms of the actual addition to my culture, those artifacts contributed, they meant absolutely nothing. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed the video. I don't usually like to do series-style videos, I instead prefer every video be a self-contained thing, and for that reason this video is very long. The reason the Florence campaign was 2 parts is purely because it took longer than I expected to make the video, and I had to get a video out for Paradox. In the future, you can expect more EU5 content like this video, a long RP story encompassing at least 1 or 2 eras of the game. I want to show off more late game stuff, but it will be difficult and take a long time. In CK3, the late game is also hard to access in the sense that it takes a long time, but I've done long videos in that game before, and I could do them for this game too. Essentially, the longer we go on in the game, the fewer details you'll get in terms of the RP and mechanics, purely because I don't want to make a 5-hour long video, but you'll get to see the late game. Maybe I'll consider continuing this Denmark game for part 2, by the way, so that more of the late game can be shown, but again, I don't like series-style videos, so we'll see. Sorry for the rant, thanks to the channel members for supporting the channel, and thank you, dear viewer, for your time.